If we want to avoid a scenario where the Chinese invade Taiwan, we need to give them the leverage to dissuade that invasion. And that's going to be in weapons deals. That's going to be in aid. That's going to be in military training. That's what that's going to be in. And we need to ramp that up. And I've seen the Biden administration starting to ramp it up. And I compliment the Biden administration for doing that. But if I'm being quite frank, it isn't enough. Let's talk about Ukraine and Taiwan, because I believe that we're seeing the invasion of Ukraine today. And if we are not careful and learn the lessons of the invasion of Ukraine, we're going to see the invasion of Taiwan tomorrow. Now, what put this idea in my head was there was an article released. It was released yesterday, or about 2 days ago now. My time, that is. I'm in Poland, of course. About America and the Chinese state going back and forth about American and Chinese relations, American and Taiwanese relations. And let me read you this article from Yahoo Finance. Originally, it originated in the South China Morning Post. Beijing responds to Blinken. If the U.S. agreed there is only one China, it cannot talk of a Taiwanese invasion. Any talk of mainland China invading Taiwan is invalid because the one China policy states that Taiwan is part of China, the foreign ministry in Beijing has said in response to comments by the U.S. Secretary of State. The United States recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, and it acknowledged the Chinese nationals' position that there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of China, according to the foreign ministry spokesman. So this goes on to go back and forth, and it is the usual American-Chinese interaction on Taiwan, which is Taiwan is a part of China, we're the real China, that is the Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, right? And therefore, you can't really complain about us invading because it's not an invasion, because it's our territory, but we all know what Americans mean when they're talking about an invasion. Everyone knows that Taiwan has its own currency. Taiwan has its own police force. Taiwan has its own government, has its own military, has its own laws, has a flourishing democracy, has a flourishing economy, has its own relations with other countries when it comes to envoys, is part of certain, but not all, international organizations. The international organizations that it is not a part of is usually due to the People's Republic of China trying to get in front of it and kind of elbowing it out of the way because it's trying to put Taiwan in a diplomatic stranglehold by isolating it internationally there, so that when it does invade Taiwan, or it does put more pressure on Taiwan to come back into the fold with mainland China, the international community won't really do much. And Taiwan can't develop the relations that would be necessary in order for it to put up much of a struggle. And that is the reality. And I do want to bring this up, that we're watching Ukraine get invaded today. And I remember a lot of people thinking, oh, this, and I hear this while filming the documentary, and I heard this from commentators online. Famously, Hassan, had a moment where he was like, dog, it's not going to happen, whatever. And a lot of other people said that. I even said that most likely it wasn't going to happen. But it did. The Russians invaded Ukraine. And if I'm being completely honest, I would say, if you're looking at historical precedent, if you're looking by statements from the Chinese state, if you're looking at Chinese foreign policy since the end of 1949, when the Chinese nationalists fled to the island, the idea of the Chinese mainland invading Taiwan and taking it by force is not really like a crazy proposal. It isn't something that if I said I expect China to invade Taiwan, that's not going to get you just dismissed out of the room and everyone's going to say, bah, that's ridiculous. Because it isn't ridiculous. If you listen to the Chinese government, they're very clear that there's red lines in the sand. There's a red line here saying that if they declare independence, they'll be invaded. There's a red line here about the one China policy in the 3 communiques. There's a red line here when it comes to this policy, a red line here when it comes to that policy, a red line when it comes to the idea that at the end of the day, Taiwan will come back into the fold. It can do it either peacefully or they will use other means. Obviously, talking about an invasion, the Chinese state, Chinese politicians, Chinese state media has been extremely explicit that they are perfectly willing to use military force, if not an invasion, possibly other military options like an embargo, which we will talk about that later. And so I was thinking about, while we're all concentrating right now on the current security crisis, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, maybe we should take a moment to reflect on a possible upcoming security crisis, which is the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And so I'm going to be basing a lot of my statements off of a really good article written by James Palmer, which is really good. I believe it's written by James Palmer. I thought it said James Palmer here. It doesn't actually say James Palmer. It's actually Bonnie Lin and John Culver. Okay, I was just completely wrong there. I want to talk about this article because this article I think is pretty good. I'm going to link it in chat, and I recommend you all read it yourselves because I read it, and I'm going to be largely basing a lot of my statements off of this article. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Russian invasion of Ukraine impacting Chinese resolve to invade Taiwan. I've heard from a lot of people online this idea that due to Russian failure in Ukraine, their failure to take Kiev, their failure to take Sumy, their failure to take Cherniv, their failure to take Kharkiv, the massive death toll they've had, the massive hit to their economy due to sanctions, the massive casualty numbers, the loss of armor, the loss of jets, the loss of munitions, the multiple strategic military defeats and tactical defeats, the sinking of the Moscow, or more commonly referred to in the media as the Moskva. The Moscow is in English, but which is the flagship, of course, of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. A lot of people are saying, wow, if this is what Western weapons are able to do against the Russian military, one of the most powerful militaries in the world, invading Ukraine, imagine what those same weapons can do in Taiwan. Imagine what would happen if it was an amphibious landing, which is more difficult to conduct than a normal on-the-ground invasion, which Russia has done, using interconnected highway systems, which should make it like 10 times easier. I'm sure China now is reconsidering its Taiwan policy. I'm sure that the PLA now is sitting there kind of shaking in their boots at the concept of invading Taiwan at this moment, because now they've lost the confidence in their military success. And I have to say, this is an extremely reductionist viewpoint. Extremely reductionist viewpoint. I do think, just like the article said, that there will probably be a short-term, maybe realignment of confidence, so to speak. They will say like, oh snap, is our military up to par? And those questions should be answered when it comes to China. A good example of this would be the fact that the Chinese Army, the PLA, the last time they fought was in 1979. That was the last war they had. They haven't had a war in the modern era. They haven't had a war in over 43 years. That is a very long time not to fight a war. That is a very long time not to be in armed combat and say, I think our military is up to snuff. All of China's power is technically, but this is a very big, technically, on paper and in concept, right? Because we haven't seen it perform in the field. If there are massive corruption issues in the PLA, we wouldn't really know it unless we saw an operation take place. If there are not extremely organized communication lines, not I would say beneficial chain of command, all these things, we wouldn't see it until it's battle tested. It's like with a lot of Russian military systems, like the Cope cages that we've heard so much about. I mean, on paper and theoretically, these were powerful weapons. The weapons manufacturers and all these different groups of people, when they talked about all these weapons You know, they talk up and hype up these weapons so much about the destructive power they have, but until we see them used in the field to effectiveness, it's all theoretical, and their job is to sell you on the power of their weapons. That's what a weapons manufacturer is supposed to do. And the PLA and Chinese government officials are supposed to sell us Americans on the effectiveness of their military. That's their job. They want to make their military look as scary as possible, because if they make it look scary enough, maybe they don't even have to use it, because they can just intimidate the other world power out of even being involved in any manner in the conflict in the South China Sea. But I want to say that even if you were to take the most extreme position against the PLA and say that the PLA was incompetent, the PLA is corrupt, it hasn't fought the war since 1979, the PLA is this, the PLA is that, for whatever reason, you don't believe the PLA can invade Taiwan. And there are military planners who say right now that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, an amphibious assault, would not necessarily be effective. And in fact, many of them say that they think they would fail at this point. We're going to get back to that. That doesn't mean that that is the only path forward for the Chinese military. An embargo is something that would not require an amphibious assault, but would still use the force of the Chinese Navy. And there's other internal pressures that, despite these possible military failings, that would push China to do an invasion if political options and diplomatic options fail. There's geopolitical concerns when it comes to Taiwan being a base for U.S. operations in the South China Sea, which the Chinese government sees as extremely important for its interests. And there are internal costs. If you talk up for years and years and years the fact that Taiwan is a part of China, an inextricable part of China, and it was stolen by the Japanese, then handed over to the Americans and the nationalists, and that they need to finish the Civil War, you reversing that position because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not going to be that simple. There's going to be a lot of people in the party domestically, and this is the same position that I think Xi Jinping holds, that is not necessarily willing to accept that. Is not willing to accept that reality, even if that was reality, which I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that there are internal pressures, not even talking about public opinion. Chinese public opinion at home in the mainland China is very clearly Taiwan is a part of China. They see it as a holdover of the century of humiliation, which the Chinese public and the Chinese government want to end. Also, here's another thing. Let's say that they don't invade the main island of Taiwan. There are islands in the Taiwanese Strait that they could compromise on invading, that they invade these islands that they've had multiple strait crises over, instead of invading the main island of Taiwan. A lot of people think there's a main island of Taiwan and that's it. That's not true. There are these small islands off the coast of China, the Taiwanese Strait, islands in the South China Sea, whatever you want to call it, that are held by the Taiwanese government. That there have been talk for a while of the idea of, in a war scenario, these islands basically have zero chance of holding up against a determined Chinese amphibious assault. They're just too close to home. They can be too easily struck by aircraft, too easily struck by artillery and missiles, and they're too small to really put up significant resistance. And then you got to include the Chinese Navy. There's just no way. It's just not happening, Chief. I am very sorry. So even if you were to convince the Chinese that an invasion of the mainland island wasn't worth it, internal pressures could still push them to do it. Geopolitical pressures could still push them to do it. And if they don't invade the main island, they could still invade the islands on the strait. What should the Americans do in a situation like that? That is a video for another day. The idea of a second strait crisis and what the United States should do then, right? But I want to say what I think is the main point of this video, and the thing that I think should keep Americans interested in this, and why Americans I think should concentrate on this after seeing what happened in Ukraine. And that is just one fact. Time is on China's side. And I think that's why a lot of people online who are throwing these like predictions of like, hey guys, China is going to invade Taiwan now because the whole world is distracted by Ukraine. I find that position ridiculous. I think it makes much more sense definitely given some reservations the Chinese state might have after seeing Western resolve when it comes to sanctions, Western resolve when it comes to sending Ukraine weapons, when it comes to seeing the Ukrainian will to fight, which Western observers, the Western governments, and of course the Russians thought that the Ukrainians would dissolve like in 2014 they did in Crimea, that the Ukrainian will to fight wouldn't be there, that Volodymyr Zelensky would get on a plane and flee the country. That didn't end up happening. The will to fight, that will to protect the Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian statehood, to defend Ukrainian democracy was there. The Chinese probably are reassessing if their judgments about Taiwanese will to fight, that it would dissolve as well, is true or not. Because America, which should be on the side of Ukraine, thought the Ukrainian government would dissolve, that it would be a matter of days. And they were wrong. And they might be wrong about that same prediction for Taiwan. And so, again, if you have all these reservations and you're seeing the West perform much better, why invade now? I don't think it really makes much sense. Invade now while those reservations are on the table and they're growing due to the invasion. Invade now when there's much information to be gathered about Western weapon performance and how the West performs in Ukraine and how Russia performs in Ukraine, and they can study Russian failures. They can study Western successes and Western failures and then make a plan following that. Be a neutral observer. I forget exactly who said this, but it was like a wise man learns from a fool learns from the mistakes of himself. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others. And I think this is an example of that, where the Chinese could sit on the sidelines and basically observe the conflict. So I don't understand why we would assume they would invade now. And I think people making that prediction are off. Definitely, since, again, I think time's on China's side. Every single day that passes, the Chinese military budget increases. The Chinese weapons industry expands. Chinese military performance continues to generally improve. Chinese weapons technology continues to improve. And we're seeing the Chinese military continue to expand, especially when it comes to the Navy, especially when it comes to the Air Force, which are both going to play a massive role in any amphibious assault. So the idea that they would right now do this assault while they have these reservations and when time benefits them to continue to gain, leverage, to continue to gain military power, it doesn't make sense for them to do it now. I think they probably plan to learn from the mistakes of the Russians, reassess certain problems they might have when it comes to Russian failures and them reflecting on those failures, and continue to gain that leverage, that strategic leverage, that military leverage, and then later put the cards on the table. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think it is inevitable, a premier interest of the Chinese state, that eventually, if they believe that the costs will not be as much as the benefits, they will put their cards on the table when it comes to an invasion of Taiwan, either by forcing the Taiwanese government to submit, either through an embargo or just a straight up amphibious invasion. If the Chinese government cannot get the Taiwanese to agree to give up their democracy, give up their sovereignty for a type of one country, two systems that we saw in Hong Kong, for example, which didn't really end up being one country, two systems. We saw that eventually the central authority of Beijing reigned supreme, and it overruled, and it started banning, for example, booing the national anthem with up to 5 years in prison. So that's fun. And so that's what I want to concentrate on. I think Americans need to be more interested in giving Taiwan leverage and understanding that the time is on the side of the Chinese government right now. And unless we massively change our relationship with Taiwan when it comes to assisting them with intel, assisting them with training, and assisting them not only with weapon sales and selling them the best, I would say, even most modern equipment, not selling them the last generation of weapons, selling them the most present generation of weapons, sending them just straight up military aid. These are the things, and heightening all of this. These are the things that Americans should consider, so we can preserve the status quo as it currently stands, which the majority of Taiwanese want to do at the moment. So we can preserve the status quo and give Taiwan the leverage for the long term to continue to, let's say, discourage a Chinese invasion. I think that's what we need to be considering. I remember talking about this 8 or 10 months ago when people were talking about Taiwan and a certain weapons deal that the Biden administration agreed to with Taiwan. People said it was an escalation, even though the hundreds of millions of dollars that we were going to agree to was not an escalation. It was a continuation of the Taiwanese Relations Act, which has been in place since 1979. It was put in place during the Carter administration, which said that we would supply the Taiwanese state with the weapons it needs to defend itself. Defend itself against what? A Chinese invasion. This has been policy of the United States for the last, 43 years? And we need to start taking that responsibility seriously if we really want to preserve the democratic freedoms of 25 million people who intend to rule themselves. And so, if we want to avoid a scenario where the Chinese invade Taiwan, we need to give them the leverage to dissuade that invasion. And that's going to be in weapons deals. That's going to be in aid. That's going to be in military training. That's what that's going to be in. And we need to ramp that up. And I've seen the Biden administration starting to ramp it up. And I compliment the Biden administration for doing that. But if I'm being quite frank, it isn't enough. At the current rate of our aid to Taiwan, it is still not significant enough to balance out against the Chinese state. I am not saying putting nuclear weapons on the peninsula, right? I am not saying we need to give them super soldiers and make it so they can take back the mainland. I am saying we need to give them the weapons they would need to dissuade an invasion and to be as militarily effective as the Ukrainians have been against a Chinese invasion, as in the Chinese mainland. And I also want to say that I think there's a lot of concerns that the West needs to take into consideration when it comes to Taiwan, right? The first concern I want to bring up is Western resolve. Right now, I think a lot of us feel pretty confident about Western resolve, right? I mean, we've seen how it's played out when it comes to Ukraine, right? We've seen more unity on the Russian invasion of Ukraine in NATO than we've seen in forever. We have the Germans agreeing to send anti-air heavy weapons to the Ukrainians. We see the Germans moving away from Russian gas. Slowly, but they're doing faster than expected. We even saw them originally, I remember 2 months ago, the idea of them agreeing to any SWIFT sanctions was preposterous to me. I didn't expect it, but they did it, and then they've gone much further. They've sent Panzerfausts. Now, do I want to see the Germans send more aid and see it actually match a higher percentage as a comparison to the GDP? Absolutely. But when we have the Biden administration talking about sending $33 billion to Ukraine in aid, and we got the UK sending aid, we got Sweden sending aid, we got Norway sending aid, we see Switzerland breaking historical neutrality on this issue to side with the Ukrainians. We got the French sending aid. We've got the French electing Emmanuel Macron in part because of Le Pen's history with Vladimir Putin and Macron's more supportive stance of Ukraine. And we've seen really good resolve here. And I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. I think that's part of the reason Ukraine has lasted so far. But let's also be honest. Ukraine and Taiwan are of much different levels of importance to European countries. And it is European countries we're seeing the most unity on this. Ukraine is within Europe. This is an expansion of an invasion that's been going on since 2014 of a European country, one of their neighbors, a country they trade with, a country that's interested in joining the European Union, a country that has interests of joining NATO, a country that many of these countries have a long storied history with. It's a break of the historic European peace. I mean, that historic European peace, I mean, we can remember Yugoslavia, of course, even though that was more of a civil war. But you could really say that it was broken in 2014. But that's the feeling you're getting from European countries, and especially their citizens. There are deeper strategic interests at play when it comes to the more active idea of a Russian invasion into a lot of other countries in Europe. Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We saw the Russians invade Georgia. We saw what they did in Chechnya, even though that wasn't an invasion technically of a separate sovereign country. And we've seen what the Russians have done in Ukraine since 2014 and the invasion since February 24th. And we see Russian interests in regaining many of its spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. It isn't the same with Taiwan. If I'm being completely blunt, the Europeans don't have the same interests. They don't. They don't care to the same extent. The Chinese government does not have some historical empire that it wants to rebuild in Europe. China is not going to invade Spain or Portugal or Ireland or the UK or Ukraine. China's not going to invade Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. Now, you can maybe make the argument that China is working to some capacity with Putin to avoid sanctions or do this or do that. Therefore, it is assisting in the invasion indirectly. But, that's a stretch to really compare it in any way to the immediate strategic interests, the immediate threat of invasion that Vladimir Putin poses to many Eastern European countries and is now currently enacting upon Ukraine. It's not the same. Also, the Russian economy is not comparable to the Chinese economy. It just isn't. It isn't. It's not the same. Whether you like it or not, it's starkly different. If it goes under and is affected by sanctions, and that's something I think the Chinese government is fearful of. I think they do think that the speed of Western sanctions and the strength of Western sanctions during this invasion is something that I do think they are calculating. But I don't think Western countries will go as far with sanctions on China. A, because they don't have the same strategic interests at play with Russia, which is a lot more immediate and a lot more in their sphere and at quote-unquote their doorstep. And B, China will probably have much more of an effect on global trade routes and the global economy and having a detrimental impact on it than sanctioning the Russian Federation will. Many of these countries have independent trade relationships with China that they will not want to scrap for Taiwan, which many of these countries don't have formal diplomatic relations with. Why would France, Spain, or a lot of these other countries be willing to put the same amount on the line for Taiwan that they've put on the line for Ukraine? If we're being completely honest, they wouldn't. I don't think they would. I think when it comes to the issue of Taiwan, our European allies are going to be lackluster. Completely lackluster. And that is why I think if we wanted to build a strong counterweight to dissuade a Chinese invasion, it has to be in Asia. It has to be the Japanese. It has to be possibly the Philippines. It has to be possibly Indonesia. It has to be possibly India. It has to be people in that sphere who could act as a counterbalance, working, doing drills with, and building ties with in between countries in order to defend Taiwan. How do you build up that alliance? Well, let me be honest with you. I've seen Biden doing some of the beginning steps of doing something like that, a Pacific NATO, if you will. But if I'm being completely honest, if I knew the ins and outs of establishing that alliance, I would be a lot wealthier. But I did just want to establish that I don't think French and British and Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian, and I don't think the Poles are going to have 200 tanks disappear from its military arsenal and just end up in the Taiwanese Strait on the streets of Taipei. I don't think that's going to happen. Let's be for real. There are no American ground troops in Ukraine. There are no French ground troops in Ukraine. There are no British ground troops in Ukraine or even Polish ground troops in Ukraine. Because all of these countries know that Russia is a nuclear state. And if nuclear states have soldiers shooting another nuclear state's soldiers, that can spiral out into an eventual nuclear war. And so, The United States has made the calculation that having ground troops on the ground in Ukraine would not be pretty cool, would not be based and red pilled, because it could mean we would all die in a nuclear hellscape, a nuclear hellfire. And that's why we've leaned on things like aid, training programs, sharing intel, massive amounts of aid, mind you. That's why we're leaning on that. Because if we were to directly combat Russian troops and not indirectly combat Russian troops, then it would be breaking a long precedent of you do not want a nuclear country's soldiers shooting another nuclear country's soldiers, because that can spiral out into a nuclear war. And I hate to inform much of my audience, but the country of China is a nuclear country. The United States is a nuclear country. And America's always held strategic ambiguity when it comes to the idea if we would assist Taiwan in a war with China. But if we assume the same principle in Ukraine applies when it comes to that threat of nuclear war, and we don't think that the Americans would place a higher strategic importance on Taiwan to an extent it would be willing to roll the dice, so to speak, then we probably would expect to not see American ground troops in Taiwan fighting Chinese soldiers. We could expect American anti-air in the hands of Taiwanese soldiers, American tanks maybe in the hands of Taiwanese soldiers, American aircraft, maybe even American ships. But I mean, we could even put a significant amount of doubt of the American Navy getting deeply involved. Possibly a standoff in an embargo scenario. But if the same principle is true of China's a nuclear country, we're a nuclear country, and China invades, do you think the American government will roll the dice on that? There's a reason why it's strategically ambiguous. It's because I don't think the American government wants to commit to that position because they know how risky that position is. And so they want to have the leverage that gives the Taiwanese for there to be a semi-question mark in the air about it, because that's another disincentive for the Chinese to invade. Because let me be honest, there might be a few American politicians, if elected president and had control of a foreign policy, might say, fuck it, let's tango. You know what I mean? And so having that question mark in the air is useful, even if you don't intend to follow through with it, because it gives the Taiwanese more leverage. But we really can't be sure that they would follow through with it. And we've seen that same principle just play out in Ukraine for the last 2 months. We sent aid, we've sent money, we've sent intel, but we have not sent ground troops. Do you think the Americans would be willing to send a Navy and ground troops for Taiwan? What would be the difference? I also do want to say that, let's say you don't care about defending Taiwanese democracy, and let's say you don't care about protecting Taiwanese sovereignty. I do want to bring up the fact that Taiwan is one of the densest countries in the world, with extremely dense cities, a population of 25 million, which is significantly higher than the Syrian population at the end of the Syrian civil war. And so we would have one of the worst refugee crises of the modern era, following, of course, the Ukrainian refugee crisis, if we were to see an invasion of Taiwan, and most likely very high civilian casualties. And for those of you who would say, oh, the Chinese state would not be willy-nilly with civilian casualties, the first thing is, I would say again, we haven't seen the Chinese state engaged in combat since 1979, so we can't say it because we haven't seen it in 43 years. We don't know how military doctrine has changed in that time when it comes to civilian casualties, because we haven't seen it play out in combat. And number two, the Russians said, hey, we're here to protect the Russian speakers, and then went on to slaughter, rape, and kill those same people in the east of the country. So I don't exactly think that's a decent argument for that. I do want to also say that in any scenario, intelligence sharing will be key. Communication lines and keeping them secure and disrupting maybe Chinese communication lines, if possible, will be key in any of these scenarios. And making sure that we give the Taiwanese as much intelligence as we can muster to give them, I think is another thing the Biden administration should do. Do I think they're already doing that? Most likely. But in case there's a rare scenario that is not happening, I do think the United States should be giving the Taiwanese as much intelligence as possible so it can more accurately determine Chinese moves and positioning and all of that. I also want to say that while the Russian invasion has been a slog that was intended to be a very rapid invasion that was resolved in 3 days, and we've now passed the 2-month point for this invasion, the Chinese government, if they engaged in an invasion, probably would not be as blatant about it as the Russians are. The article that we in foreign policy that I'm sourcing for a lot of this talked about this, about in the time that the Russians were amassing troops on the border to try to pressure Ukraine to submit, the United States was sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. It was very accurate when it came to estimating Russian military moves. And the country was being flooded with advisors, military advisors that is, and weapons. I think the Chinese saw that. And I assume that they would want to make sure that doesn't happen with Taiwan. That in multi-month period while they amass troops, and maybe it would of course maybe like in a scenario where they're trying to slowly move up the pressure before an invasion. It could happen, but I'm just bringing this up because I think the article made a good point that the Chinese could learn from that mistake and instead try to conceal their movements, and if we don't have decent intelligence, launch a surprise attack, try to decapitate the government and take over the country. And learning from the mistakes of the Russians is something that I do want to bring it back to end on, that I think the Chinese are probably going to do. I think that a lot of people who are saying, well, this will dissuade the Chinese from invading, while I understand the arguments, and I do think it has some valid points that we can listen to, this is also great intelligence for the Chinese state to gather on Russian failures and American military performance and intelligence sharing and support for one of its quote-unquote proxies, which, Ukraine. And Taiwan is similarly an American ally, and I think they would expect America to take possibly a very similar approach here, definitely if it's successful in Ukraine. So this is valuable intelligence for the Chinese. And so I've gotten through all my points here on this piece of paper, so I just want to wrap up with saying that the same fight that would be fought in Ukraine when it comes for the defense of democracy and the defense of a level of sovereignty if people wish to rule themselves would ultimately be fought on the shores of Taiwan, from the Taiwanese Strait all the way to Taipei in a invasion scenario. And if we're not careful, Ukraine today will be Taiwan tomorrow. And we should do everything in our power to give the Taiwanese leverage so they can avoid that, or if it is tomorrow, so they can win. Anyway, that is probably the longest foreign policy rant I've ever gone on in the entirety of my time on Political Twitch. So, there you go. There you go. That's what a bunch of notes produced.